They rot alive from the inside. Their bones crumble to dust. From their throats comes bloody foam with the taste of copper and decay. This is not a scene from a horror movie. It was a fashion. In the 19th century, high society was seized by a fever, consumption chic. Aristocratic women drank vinegar and lemon juice on an empty stomach to make their skin deathly pale, almost transparent. Aristocratic shadows settled under their eyes, a sign of refined fragility. They put belladonna extract, deadly nightshade, into their eyes so that their pupils would dilate and their gaze would acquire a mad, feverish glint. They laced themselves into the vice of corsets, breaking their ribs and displacing their internal organs. In March 1892, 2 months after Mercy's funeral, they dug up the graves. The bodies of her mother and older sister were already severely decomposed, but the body of Mercy, buried in winter in the frozen ground, looked almost untouched. Liquid blood was found in her heart and liver. For the frightened farmers, this was irrefutable proof. The girl's heart and liver were cut out, burned on a nearby rock, and the ashes were mixed with water and given to the ailing Edwin to drink. This monstrous ritual did not save him. He died 2 months later. This story is a prime example of how fear of an invisible disease turned people into monsters. They did not understand that Koch's bacillus could lie dormant in the body for years and then activate in different family members one by one, creating the illusion of a curse. They did not know that the preservation of a body in frozen ground and the presence of liquid blood are normal post-mortem processes. They were searching for a simple, supernatural explanation for a complex biological phenomenon. And in their search, they were prepared to do anything. The Industrial Revolution did not just create the ideal conditions for the spread of tuberculosis. It created an entire class of people doomed to this disease. Workers in the textile mills of Manchester and Liverpool spent 12 or 14 hours in stuffy workshops clogged with cotton dust. Miners in Wales and Pennsylvania breathed in coal dust, which settled in their lungs, causing silicosis, an occupational disease that left their lungs completely defenseless against Koch's bacillus. They lived in barracks and basements. Several families to a room were underfed and never saw the sun. For the mycobacterium, it was heaven on earth. At the same time, at the other pole of society, in luxurious mansions, tuberculosis also reaped its harvest, but in a different way. Here, it became part of the culture. Alexandre Dumas' Fils' La Dame aux Camélias, which Verdi would later adapt into the opera La Traviata, is a hymn to the consumptive courtesan Marguerite Gautier. Her illness, her pallor, her bloody cough, all of it only emphasized her tragic beauty and made her even more desirable. In Hugo's Les Miserables, the unfortunate Fantine dies of consumption. The Bronte sisters, whose novels are full of Gothic melancholy, nearly all died from this disease. Death from consumption became good form, a sign of a delicate constitution. This duality, a repulsive disease for the poor and a romantic tragedy for the rich, persisted until science tore all the masks off tuberculosis. René Laennec's invention was not just a technical breakthrough. It changed the very nature of the relationship between doctor and patient. Before the stethoscope, to listen to the lungs, a doctor had to press their ear directly to the patient's chest. This was awkward, unhygienic, and especially difficult with overweight patients or women whose bodies were considered inviolable. The stethoscope created a necessary distance, turning diagnosis into a more objective and scientific process. But even after Koch's discovery and the proof of the disease's infectious nature, the inertia of thought was immense. Many doctors continued to believe in hereditary predisposition, and society long continued to see the sick not as victims of a bacterium, but as people with bad blood, with a congenital defect. This label was almost as terrifying as the disease itself. It destroyed reputations, hindered marriages, and cast a shadow over the entire family. Sanatoriums, which became a symbol of the era of the fight against tuberculosis, were worlds unto themselves. In Davos, Switzerland, described by Thomas Mann in The Magic Mountain, time flowed differently. The day was scheduled to the minute. Precise times for meals, for walks, for the mandatory afternoon rest on the balcony, wrapped in blankets and furs, even if it was freezing outside. This was called the rest cure. Patients breathed the healing mountain air, ate abundantly, and had endless conversations about their symptoms, temperature, and doctors' prognoses. It was a life of waiting for recovery or death. Romances blossomed here, intrigues were woven, philosophical disputes flared up. But behind the facade of this measured, almost resort-like life hid a constant fear. An empty chair at the dining table, a sudden bloody cough from a neighbor on the balcony, a nighttime transfer to the ward for the dying. All of this was a constant reminder of the fragility of their existence. The sanatorium was a gilded cage from which there were only two ways out. The surgical treatments used before the antibiotic era seem like torture today. Artificial pneumothorax, where a lung was switched off from breathing, was a temporary measure, but sometimes adhesions prevented the lung from collapsing. The surgeon would then insert a special instrument with a red-hot platinum loop at its end, a thoracoscope, into the chest cavity and cauterize these adhesions. The operation was performed almost blindly and often resulted in massive bleeding or purulent pleurisy. Thoracoplasty was even more brutal. The surgeon would remove from 3 to 7 ribs, sometimes more. The chest wall on that side would collapse inward, permanently compressing the diseased lung. The person would survive, but their body was disfigured, and their respiratory function was permanently impaired. Patients after such an operation could not sleep on their healthy side and suffered from chronic pain and shortness of breath. This was the price of life, and many were willing to pay it. All for the sake of an emaciated, almost bodiless figure. The Lübeck disaster in 1930, when 251 infants were inoculated with a live culture of tuberculosis due to laboratory negligence, had far-reaching consequences. The professors responsible for the vaccine were put on trial. The public was horrified. Newspapers around the world were filled with headlines about the dead babies of Lübeck. This incident delayed mass BCG vaccination for decades in many countries, including Germany and the United States. The fear of the vaccine proved stronger than the fear of the disease. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people who could have been protected were left defenseless. The discovery of streptomycin by Selman Waksman in 1943 was like a miracle. The first clinical trial showed incredible results. Patients who were considered hopeless, whose disease was in its final stages, began to recover. Fevers subsided, coughs ceased, and X-rays showed that cavities were closing. It seemed that the age-old enemy had finally been defeated, but the euphoria was short-lived. Soon, doctors noticed that after a few months of treatment, the disease returned in many patients, and streptomycin no longer worked on them. Koch's bacillus quickly learned to resist. It became clear that it could not be defeated with a single drug. This spurred the search for new medicines and led to the creation of combination therapy. The idea was simple: attack the bacterium with several drugs at once, each with a different mechanism of action, so that it would not have a chance to develop resistance to all of them simultaneously. This strategy still works today. But the devil, as always, is in the details. Tuberculosis treatment requires iron discipline from the patient. He must take a handful of pills every day at the same time for many months and sometimes years. Many of these drugs are very toxic. They cause nausea, damage the liver, and affect vision and hearing. When the patient feels better after a couple of months, there is a huge temptation to stop treatment. And this is the biggest mistake. When a patient stops taking medication prematurely, the weakest bacteria in his body die. But the strongest ones, those that already have mutations providing drug resistance, survive. Deprived of competition, they begin to multiply rapidly. The disease returns with renewed force, but now it is a different disease. This is multi-drug-resistant tuberculosis, MDR-TB, and treating it is much more difficult, longer, and more expensive. And when this patient coughs on the subway or a bus, he transmits an already formed, fully resistant form of the disease to another person. A patient with extensively drug-resistant tuberculosis, XDR-TB, is a 21st century tragedy. For him, there are practically no effective drugs. His treatment becomes an experimental therapy using toxic last resort drugs that cripple the body but do not always kill the bacterium. Such a patient must be kept in strict isolation to avoid infecting others. He becomes an outcast, a medical leper. It is a return to the Middle Ages, but with an adjustment for modern technology. This is precisely why the war on tuberculosis is being waged today, not only in hospitals but also in laboratories. The arms race between scientists and the mycobacterium does not stop for a second. Pharmaceutical companies around the world are searching for new molecules capable of piercing the armor of resistant strains. The development and testing of a new drug take 10-15 years and cost hundreds of millions of dollars. But the bacterium needs much less time to find a way to circumvent it. The union of tuberculosis and HIV is a perfect storm. HIV infection systematically destroys the immune system, namely the T lymphocytes, which play a key role in containing Koch's bacillus. In a healthy person, the immune system can keep the dormant infection under control for decades, enclosing it in tiny scars in the lungs. But as soon as HIV weakens the immune system, these prisons are destroyed and the bacteria break free. For an HIV-positive person, tuberculosis is a death sentence that is carried out with terrifying speed. Despite the grim picture, humanity is slowly but surely pushing back its ancient enemy. The key to victory is a comprehensive approach. Early diagnosis using modern molecular tests that, in a couple of hours, not only detect the bacterium's DNA but also determine its drug susceptibility. Strictly controlled treatment, where a nurse ensures that the patient takes every dose of the medication. The development of new, less toxic, and more effective drugs. And, of course, the creation of a new, more advanced vaccine capable of protecting not only children but also adults. The fight against tuberculosis is not only a medical but also a social task. The disease thrives where poverty, hunger, poor living conditions, and low levels of education prevail. As long as slums, overcrowded prisons, and refugee camps exist in the world, Koch's bacillus will always have a staging ground for its offensive. It can only be defeated completely by defeating the social ills that feed it. This is a long and difficult war, but for the first time in its history, humanity has a real chance to win it. The main thing is not to forget that the enemy does not sleep. It is simply waiting for us to lose our vigilance. Being sick became beautiful. To wither was exquisite. The ideal of beauty became a dying woman, refined, melancholic, too delicate for this coarse world. Romantic poets, from Keats to Byron, celebrated the tragic beauty of consumptive maidens. Their semi-transparent skin, burning eyes, and the scarlet spots of blush on their cheeks. This flush was not a sign of health. It was a flag that death hoisted on the face. Behind the romantic image of a pale maiden coughing into a lace handkerchief hid a repulsive, humiliating reality. But the nightmare was only just beginning. The cough, which at first seemed like just a delicate clearing of the throat, grew into racking, chest-tearing fits. Fits that made ribs crack and vision go dark. Lace handkerchiefs could no longer hide the thick clots of blood and pus. The victim would spit them out along with pieces of their own lungs. Under skin as thin as parchment, inflamed lymph nodes swelled. They turned the neck into a hideous, lumpy mess, which was called a scrofula necklace. At night, the body was drenched in cold, clammy sweat. The sheets had to be wrung out, and a debilitating fever would not break for weeks, slowly burning the person from the inside. This is tuberculosis, a disease that turned the lungs into a rotting, bleeding sponge. The body became its own tomb long before it was lowered into the ground. 200 years ago, it wiped out entire continents, taking tens of millions of lives, erasing entire families from the face of the earth. But the nightmare hasn't ended. It has merely lain dormant, learned to wait. Today, in the 21st century, almost a third of the planet's population carries this time bomb within them. And most of them don't even suspect it. We have defeated smallpox. We have almost forgotten the plague and cholera. We have cornered polio. But why is this ancient killer known since the time of the pharaohs still among us? And why, with each passing year, does it only become stronger, smarter, and more resistant to all our weapons? One patient with an active form of tuberculosis infects an average of 10 to 15 healthy people per year. 10 random passers-by, 15 fellow passengers in a subway car. They simply cough, speak, breathe, and sow invisible death around them. This disease is as old as civilization itself. Its traces, characteristic lesions and destruction on the vertebrae, have been found in the bones of people who lived 9,000 years before our era in the territory of modern-day Israel. They did not yet know metal, but they already knew this internal rot. The ancient Egyptians built pyramids and embalmed pharaohs, creating masterpieces that have survived millennia, but they could not save them from this quiet decay. In the spine of the mummy of the priest Nesberahan, who lived 1,000 years before our era, scientists discovered the typical traces of spinal tuberculosis, Pott's disease. Our ancestors feared tuberculosis panically, with a primal fear. In the laws of Babylon, the Code of Hammurabi, it was clearly stipulated, If a wife developed an unhealthy flush and a cough, the husband received the full right to divorce. She was declared unclean, cursed, and simply put out the door, to die on the street alone, in filth and poverty. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus wrote that the legendary 300 Spartans who fell at the pass of Thermopylae were, in essence, a suicide squad, already doomed by consumption. And after the battle, an epidemic broke out in the Persian army, forcing King Xerxes to halt his victorious advance. Not spears and swords, but a microscopic killer changed the course of world history. The very old name of the disease, consumption, comes from the word to wither. The victims faded away before one's eyes, sometimes in a matter of months, transforming from blooming young men and women into living skeletons, draped in parchment-like skin. The disease devoured them from within, starting with the lungs, but never stopping there. Its hunger was insatiable. Tuberculosis could affect any organ: kidneys, brain, eyes, skin, bones. The only things it couldn't touch were hair and nails. In the early stages, tiny areas of inflammation, tubercles, developed in the affected organ. Then they would merge and necrotize, forming cavities filled with pus and the products of tissue decay, caverns. When these caverns ruptured into the bronchi, the person would begin to cough up blood. In tuberculosis of the bones, known as Pott's disease, channels or fistulas would form in the skeleton, through which pus oozed out. The appearance of fistulas meant that the disease had entered its final, most agonizing stage. There was no turning back. In ancient Rus, this stage was called the evil dryness, and it was treated with fire. The method was monstrously simple and cruel. A log was heated red-hot in a fire, the flames were beaten off it, and it was used to cauterize the festering wounds on the patient's body. In 1071, Grand Prince Sviatoslav Yaroslavich was subjected to this treatment. This torture did not restore his health, but only added unbearable suffering before the inevitable end. For centuries, people associated consumption with mysticism, with curses. In New England in the 18th and 19th centuries, tuberculosis outbreaks gave rise to a genuine vampire panic. When people in a family died one after another, growing pale and fading away, it was believed that the first to die returned from the grave as a vampire and drained the life from their relatives. The bodies were exhumed in the middle of the night by torchlight, and if liquid blood was found in the heart, a common phenomenon during decomposition, the vampire's heart was cut out and burned on a stone. The ashes were then mixed with water and given to the surviving family members to drink as a cure. The most famous case is the story of Mercy Brown of Rhode Island, which occurred in 1892. Tuberculosis epidemics plagued Europe for centuries, but the most terrible of them broke out in the mid-17th century. It was called the Great White Plague. If the Black Death, the bubonic plague, was like a wildfire, coming, burning everything to the ground in a couple of years, and leaving, the White Plague was like a slow, relentless smoldering. It was in no hurry. It settled in the cities for 2 centuries, becoming a part of daily life. Beginning in 1605, the epidemic only began to decline by the 19th century. At its peak, 1 in 7 inhabitants of Europe died from it. In London, the mortality rate reached 20%. Cities choked with coughing. Death became commonplace. But the true golden age of this disease, its triumph, was yet to come. The Industrial Revolution of the 19th century was a boon for tuberculosis. Cities mushroomed, people lived in incredibly crowded conditions, in damp, dark, unventilated slums where sunlight never touched the walls. Factory smoke and coal dust corroded the lungs, making them utterly defenseless against infection. Wars, famine, and cold only fueled the epidemic, pushing it to new heights. During the First World War, scientists conducted large-scale statistical studies for the first time. They wanted to understand who the disease's main target was. The results proved to be shocking and counterintuitive. Those at risk were not children or the elderly, as one might expect. Tuberculosis most often struck the strongest and youngest, people between the ages of 15 and 35. It took away the nation's future, its flower, its hope. The fear of contagion was primal, irrational. The moment a person began to cough, the moment that telltale feverish blush appeared on their cheeks, they immediately became an outcast. People shied away from them on the streets. They were denied work. They were thrown out of their homes by their own families, who feared they would infect the children. Even the great composer Frédéric Chopin experienced this horror firsthand. When the consumptive Chopin traveled to Majorca with George Sand, hoping that the warm Mediterranean climate would ease his suffering, he was not allowed on board a passenger ship. He had to sail on a cargo vessel that transported pigs, amidst a revolting stench and filth. The owner of the villa where the musician stayed ordered all the furniture Chopin had touched to be burned after his departure. The doorknobs, the bed, the chairs, even his precious piano and sheet music. Everything was consigned to the flames as if plague-ridden, and the bill for the destroyed property was presented to the composer himself, as if to a criminal. The reason for such panic was that upon arrival, Chopin suffered a severe pulmonary hemorrhage. He nearly died right before the eyes of the hotel staff. People saw the blood, they smelled the stench of death, but they could not see the enemy. They knew the disease was contagious, but they had no idea what caused it. The mystery of the White Plague remained unsolved, giving rise to the wildest theories. Some blamed heredity, some blamed poor food, and others divine punishment for sins. The name tuberculosis itself comes from the Latin word tuberculum, which means a small lump. This term was coined in the 17th century by the French anatomist Jacobus Sylvius. While dissecting corpses, he was the first to notice that the surface of the lungs of those who died from consumption was dotted with strange nodules and spots. But he did not understand their nature, considering them a variant of hardened lymphatic glands, or even a form of tumor. He saw the killer's tracks, but not the killer himself. Only 100 years later, in 1804, another Frenchman, the physician René Laennec, established a direct link between these lumps and the disease itself. He also revolutionized diagnostics. Laennec had grown tired of the humiliating and inaccurate procedure of listening to a patient's chest with his ear, especially when it came to corpulent female patients. According to legend, the idea came to him when he saw two children playing with a long wooden beam. One was scratching one end, while the other, with his ear pressed to the other end, could clearly hear the sound. Laennec rolled a sheet of paper into a tube, placed one end on the patient's chest and the other to his ear. The sounds of the heart and breathing were heard with astonishing clarity. Thus, from a simple sheet of paper, the stethoscope was born. Later, he made it from wood. This simple tube became for doctors what the telescope was for astronomers. It allowed one to hear the breath of disease, to hear moist rails, the gurgling of pus in decaying cavities, the whistle of air passing through narrowed bronchi. No specific rails. no cause for concern. The method was far from perfect, but at the time, it seemed like a miracle. It allowed one to look inside a living person without cutting them open. This invention, this desire to understand the disease, cost René Laennec his life. He was obsessed with studying tuberculosis. Day and night, he autopsied the bodies of the deceased and listened to the dying, taking no precautions, inhaling air full of deadly particles. He contracted the infection from his patients and died at the age of 45, having had time to hear in his own lungs the very same deadly rails he had studied so well. He became a victim of the monster he was the first to face, but the monster still remained nameless and invisible. Doctors knew that the disease was transmitted from person to person, but how? Through breath? Through touch? Or was it some miasma, a poisonous fog hanging over the cities? The infectious nature of tuberculosis was not definitively proven until 1865, and this happened far from the European capitals, in the confined world of a French warship. A ship's doctor named Jean-Antoine Villemain encountered an outbreak of tuberculosis among the sailors in the cramped, stuffy confines of the ship. He noticed that the disease was spreading from bunk to bunk, as if an invisible relay of death was being passed on. He decided to conduct a cruel but necessary experiment. He collected the sputum that the sick coughed up and injected it under the skin of guinea pigs and rabbits. The animals became ill and died. Their lungs were riddled with the same tubercles as in humans. Thus, it was irrefutably proven. The disease was caused not by bad air or poor nutrition, but by some contagious agent contained in the patient's secretions. But which one exactly? Microbiology in those years was in its infancy. The capabilities of optics were limited, and methods for cultivating bacteria were primitive. It seemed the killer would remain invisible forever. All these problems were destined to be solved by one man, the German doctor Robert Koch, a man of incredible perseverance and brilliant intuition. By the end of the 19th century, Koch already had a reputation as a brilliant researcher, a true microbe hunter. He had isolated and described the causative agent of anthrax and developed methods for staining bacteria and cultivating them on solid nutrient media, which are still used today. In the early 1880s, Robert Koch was living in Berlin. The government had provided him with his own laboratory. His main goal, his obsession, was to find the causative agent of tuberculosis. It was a real race. Germany's national prestige was at stake, as Koch's main rival, Louis Pasteur, was working in France. Koch gains access to countless tissue samples from patients at the famous Charité Clinic in Berlin. He spends days and nights, weeks, months at the microscope. He uses every staining method known to him, but he sees nothing. The field of view remains clear. The infectious agent is elusive, like a ghost. Then Koch comes to a brilliant conclusion. The microbe must be completely transparent, and its cell wall does not accept ordinary dyes. It must be forced to reveal itself, to be stained. But with what? A titanic effort begins. Koch tries hundreds of dye variants, one after another. Week after week, month after month, only failures. The laboratory is saturated with the smell of chemicals, formalin, and despair. And then, the 271st attempt. He takes a tissue sample, stains it with an alkaline solution of methylene blue, and then, after 24 hours, adds Vesuvin, a reddish-brown dye used in the leather industry, to the slide. He then washes the sample with a solvent that should remove all the dye from ordinary cells. He looks into the eyepiece of the microscope, and finally, he sees it, the culprit of millions of deaths. Against the blue background of dead human cells, thin, slightly curved rods glowed a bright brown. They had retained the dye. They were different. It was a triumph. On March 24, 1882, Koch announced his discovery at a meeting of the Berlin Physiological Society. There was dead silence in the hall. When he finished, no one asked a single question. Everyone was stunned. For the first time, humanity saw its enemy face to face. For the discovery of the bacterium, named Koch's bacillus in his honor, the scientist received the Nobel Prize in 1905. The Latin name for Koch's bacillus is Mycobacterium tuberculosis. It is a tiny organism, tens of times thinner than a human hair, but by the standards of the microworld, it is a true armored monster. Its outer shell consists of fats and wax, which makes it impermeable to most disinfectants and to the protective cells of our immune system, macrophages. Koch's bacillus is extremely resilient in the external environment. In dried sputum, in the dust of a dark room at a temperature of 23 degrees, it can remain viable for up to 7 years. It is not afraid of the cold, it can withstand freezing, but it is afraid of direct sunlight, ultraviolet light, and chemical substances containing chlorine and hydrogen peroxide. That is why these agents are still used for disinfection today. Now that the enemy was known, Koch decided he could quickly create a weapon against it. In 1890, with great fanfare, he presented to the world a substance he called tuberculin. It was an extract from heat-killed tuberculosis bacilli. Koch, blinded by his previous successes and driven by public pressure, made a fatal mistake. He declared that he had found not just a preventive agent but a cure. He claimed that tuberculin cured the disease. He tested it on guinea pigs, on himself, and on his young assistant, who later became his wife. The news caused euphoria around the world. Thousands of tuberculosis patients flocked to Berlin, hoping for a miraculous cure. It was a true pilgrimage of the desperate. Hotels were overflowing. People slept in train stations and parks just to get the coveted injection. But the miracle did not happen. The substance turned out to be not just useless, but extremely toxic. It contained too many impurities from the culture medium in which the bacteria were grown. Tuberculin caused a severe allergic reaction, fever, and inflammation, which only accelerated tissue decay. In 20% of cases, the use of tuberculin itself led to death. It was a resounding failure, the greatest disappointment in the history of medicine. Koch's reputation was destroyed. However, tuberculin, having failed as a medicine, found another application. It became an indispensable tool for diagnosis. In 1907, the Austrian pediatrician Clemens von Pirquet noticed that the body of a person already familiar with Koch's bacillus reacts much more actively to the introduction of tuberculin. He proposed making small scratches on the skin and dropping the substance there. By the size of the redness, one could determine whether a person was infected or not. Thus, the Pirquet test was born. A year later, the French physician Charles Mantoux improved this method, proposing to inject tuberculin not on the skin, but intradermally. This test, familiar to all of us from childhood, proved to be much more accurate and convenient. If, after 3 days, an induration, a papule, less than 5 millimeters in diameter formed at the injection site, the body was clear or the immune system had coped. If more than 5 millimeters, an infection was likely present in the body. And if the induration reached 15 millimeters or more, the disease was in an active stage. The myth that the Mantoux test should not get wet, by the way, is connected precisely with its predecessor, the Pirquet test. When applied to a scratch, water could indeed wash away the substance and distort the result. The Mantoux test is not afraid of water. So, by the beginning of the 20th century, doctors knew the enemy by sight. The Pirquet and Mantoux tests made it possible to detect the disease at an early stage. And thanks to the rays discovered in 1895 by Wilhelm Röntgen, tuberculous cavities in the lungs could be seen without opening up the patient. Fluorography became a mass and inexpensive method of screening. But treatment still remained abysmal. The epidemic continued its triumphant march. Consumption was everywhere. It was considered a disease of the poor, but everyone died from it. In London, Prime Minister Disraeli died of tuberculosis. In Vienna, the writer Franz Kafka, who described his cough as the howl of an animal. In Paris, the wife of the artist Claude Monet, Camille. The artist captured her deathbed, her emaciated gray face, in one of his most tragic paintings. In Russia, 5 times more people died from consumption than from all types of typhus combined. By 1917, for the entire vast country, there were only 43 anti-tuberculosis dispensaries and 18 sanatoriums, a paltry 1,000 beds for millions of patients. On April 20th, 1911, the first anti-tuberculosis day was held in Russia. Its symbol became the white chamomile, a sign of pure breath and fragile life. Members of the Tsarist family appeared in public with bouquets of chamomiles, drawing attention to the problem. The great opera singer Fyodor Chalyapin took the stage of the Mariinsky Theater that day in a tailcoat strewn with white flowers. At a charity concert, he managed to raise 30,000 rubles for the sick, a colossal sum for those times, but it was a drop in the ocean. After the Revolution and the Civil War, the Soviet government began a massive, systemic fight against tuberculosis. Dispensaries were opened and patients were registered. Special attention was paid to prevention. Don't spit in the trash can. Keep your home clean. Eat properly. Vladimir Mayakovsky rhymed lines for propaganda posters, and they were drawn by avant-garde artists like Alexander Rodchenko. But there was still no effective treatment. The only thing doctors could offer was climatic therapy and rest. Thus, a whole culture of sanatoriums emerged. Mountain and seaside resorts, like Switzerland's Davos, which became the prototype for Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, turned into luxurious prisons for wealthy patients. A strict routine reigned there. Hours spent on open verandas, wrapped in furs, with abundant food and complete rest. For the poor, however, there were state sanatoriums with more modest conditions, but the same idea: sun, fresh air, and enhanced nutrition were supposed to give the body a chance to fight the disease on its own. But most often, conservative methods did not work, and then surgeons stepped in. The main method of treatment remained surgical, a brutal excision of the affected part of the lung. In addition, doctors began to use artificial pneumothorax. Using a special hollow needle, the patient's chest was punctured, and air was pumped into the pleural cavity. The lung would compress, collapse, and become temporarily immobile. This gave it a chance to heal cavities and prevented the infection from developing. The procedure was painful and required regular top-ups of air. If even this did not help, they resorted to even more radical and maiming operations. One of them was thoracoplasty, the removal of several ribs on one side so that the chest wall would collapse inward and permanently compress the diseased lung. A person's body frame was literally broken. It was a desperate measure that turned a person into an invalid with a contorted torso, but it sometimes saved their life. Another method was phrenicotomy, or phrenic crush, the severing or crushing of the phrenic nerve. This paralyzed one half of the diaphragm, causing it to rise and compress the lung from below. All these methods were therapies of desperation, an attempt to stop a fire by destroying part of the house. One of the most famous victims of tuberculosis in Russia was the writer Anton Pavlovich Chekhov. His story is the tragedy of a man who, being a doctor himself, ignored his own illness until the very end. 4 people in his family died from consumption, including his beloved brother Nikolai. He himself first noticed blood in his sputum at the age of 24. But Dr. Chekhov ignored the symptoms. He let the disease run its course. He surrendered to the doctors only 13 years later. He was hospitalized almost by force. This happened after he started coughing up blood at a banquet celebrating the opening of a new theater season. He left a detailed description of his medical history, which reads like a death sentence. The hemoptysis was profuse. The blood flowed from the right lung. After that, I would notice blood about twice a year. Every winter, autumn, and spring, and on every damp day I cough. There is something sinister in the blood flowing from the mouth, like a fiery glow. Analyzing his notes, we can understand. It was already impossible to save Chekhov. By the beginning of the 20th century, the disease was too advanced. The treatment his colleagues prescribed was merely symptomatic. Morphine to relieve pain, a codeine solution, and ice cubes to soothe his cough. Chekhov refused pneumothorax, perhaps the most effective method at the time. He died on July 15, 1904. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, in the German resort town of Badenweiler, after asking for a glass of champagne before his death. The real breakthrough only came in 1921. French scientists Albert Calmette and Camille Guérin, after 13 years of work and 230 passages on a culture medium, managed to create an attenuated vaccine strain of bovine mycobacterium. They grew the culture on a medium containing bovine bile, which suppressed the bacterium's virulence. This is how the first vaccine against tuberculosis appeared, the famous BCG, Bacillus Calmette-Guérin. From that moment on, doctors finally learned how to prevent the disease, but its implementation was not smooth. In 1930, a tragedy occurred in the German city of Lübeck. Due to a laboratory error, 251 infants were vaccinated with a live, virulent culture of tuberculosis. 72 children died. This catastrophe undermined trust in vaccination for many years to come. And in 1943, at the height of World War II, the American microbiologist Selman Waksman, an émigré from the Russian Empire, discovered streptomycin, the first antibiotic effective against Koch's bacillus. It was isolated from soil bacteria. The era of antibiotics began. Drugs capable of killing the bacterium that had already attacked the body. For his discovery, Waksman received the Nobel Prize in 1952. It seemed that victory was near. A vaccine and medicines had appeared. Soon, other drugs were discovered. Isoniazid, rifampicin, ethambutol. Drug therapy for tuberculosis is a long and serious process. A course of treatment can take from 6 months to 2 years. Every detail is important: dosage, frequency of administration, and duration of the course. The slightest deviation from the regimen recommended by a doctor, and tuberculosis goes on the offensive again. But humanity was given a real chance. However, Koch's bacillus turned out to be a much more insidious opponent than anyone could have imagined. It began to adapt, to mutate. The drugs that worked half a century ago are now increasingly proving to be useless. The bacterium develops drug resistance. This happens when patients do not complete the full course of treatment. They feel better, stop taking their pills, and the strongest, most resistant bacteria survive in their bodies. It is these that then multiply and are transmitted to other people. And this is where a real arms race begins, involving chemists, biologists, and technologists from all over the world. Creating a new drug means years of research and millions of dollars. But the bacterium learns to bypass the defense in a much shorter time. A new, even more terrifying monster has appeared: multi-drug-resistant tuberculosis, MDR-TB. This is a form of the disease that is resistant to at least two of the most powerful drugs, isoniazid and rifampicin. But that is not the limit. There is extensively drug-resistant tuberculosis, XDR-TB, which does not respond to treatment with either first or second-line drugs. Treating these forms becomes a living hell. It lasts for years, requires taking dozens of toxic pills a day, and causes monstrous side effects: deafness, kidney failure, psychosis, constant nausea, and joint pain. And even with such treatment, the chances of survival do not exceed 50%. This is, in essence, a return to the pre-antibiotic era. Today, tuberculosis is treated with a combination of 4 or 5 drugs simultaneously, in order to strike from different angles and give the bacterium no chance. Most of these drugs were developed back in the 1960s, and their effectiveness is declining. Therefore, scientists are searching for new molecules, new chemical formulas. For example, in Russia, in Irkutsk, where more than half of all domestic anti-tuberculosis drugs are produced, one of the newest drugs capable of combating resistant forms of tuberculosis was developed. Its international name is perchlazone. It suppresses the viability of even those mycobacteria that have learned to resist the old drugs. The capabilities of a modern pharmaceutical plant would seem like absolute science fiction to Robert Koch and Selman Waxman. Sterile workshops where all processes take place in sealed isolator boxes. Robotic manipulators work with highly active substances, completely eliminating human contact with hazardous materials. Every half hour, lab technicians take samples, checking the quality at every stage of production. This is a war waged at the microscopic level, in complete silence and sterility, a war for the purity and effectiveness of every molecule. And yet, despite all these achievements, tuberculosis in the 21st century remains one of the deadliest infections on the planet. Every year, it kills about 1.5 million people, more than HIV and malaria combined. According to the World Health Organization, countries like China, India, Russia, Nigeria, and Pakistan are still on the front lines of this war. The disease that we considered a relic of the past, a legacy of the Dark Ages and filthy slums, is still here. It thrives where there is poverty, overcrowding, and weakened immunity. It hides in prisons, in homeless shelters, in refugee camps, and then comes out onto the city streets with its carriers. HIV has become a deadly ally of tuberculosis. The immunodeficiency virus destroys the very cells that are supposed to fight Koch's bacillus. For a person with HIV infection, the probability of developing active tuberculosis is 20-30 times higher. This lethal duo, the cursed tandem, claims hundreds of thousands of lives every year. But there is also good news. According to the same WHO statistics, since 2000, the global mortality rate from tuberculosis has decreased by 41%. The lives of more than 49 million people have been saved. Modern medicine has something to counter the ancient enemy. The development of early diagnostic methods, like rapid tests that give results in 2 hours, the development of new drugs, and an understanding of the bacterium's resistance mechanisms, all of this allows us to say with confidence that sooner or later, tuberculosis will become a part of medical history. This disease must be cured by time, science, and the will of humanity. The only question is how much more time will be needed for a complete healing, and how many more lives the White Plague will take before it finally recedes into the past, remaining only in the pages of novels and in the grim legends of days long gone. The romanticization of death was only one side of the coin. The other was panic. In medieval Europe, where hygiene was an abstract concept and medicine a mixture of superstition and cruelty, there was another form of tuberculosis that inspired no less terror than the pulmonary kind. This was scrofula, or the king's evil, tuberculosis of the lymph nodes, most often in the neck. The nodes would become inflamed, merge into clusters, and then burst open, forming non-healing, festering ulcers. Because of these ulcers covering the patient's neck, the disease was popularly known as the king's evil. It was believed that only the touch of God's anointed, the king, could cure it. This ritual, known as the royal touch, was practiced for centuries in England and France. Thousands of sufferers, from beggars to aristocrats, would line up for the monarch in hopes of a miraculous healing. The king would touch their ulcers, say a prayer, and give them a special coin amulet. Of course, this did not help, but it gave desperate people hope and strengthened the sacred authority of the crown. This fashion for sickness, this consumptive chic, was a product not only of literature, but also of painting. Pre-Raphaelite artists, such as Dante Gabriel Rossetti, loved to depict languid, pale women with huge, sad eyes and a shock of red hair. Their muses were often women of fragile health, whose beauty seemed unearthly, ephemeral. Elizabeth Siddal, Rossetti's wife and model, became an icon of this style. Her paleness and fragility were not an act. She suffered from tuberculosis and died young, forever remaining on her husband's canvases as a symbol of tragic, fading beauty. But behind the doors of artists' studios and literary salons, reality was devoid of any romance. The rooms of the sick were saturated with the heavy, sweetish smell of decay and medicine. The silence was broken only by a hacking cough and gurgling rattles coming from the chest. As the disease progressed, the body withered away. Fat and muscle tissue melted, the skin became dry, wrinkled, and stretched tightly over the bones of the skull, turning the face into a death mask. This process, known as cachexia, was irreversible. The person was literally consuming themselves. Besides the famous Pott's disease, which affected the spine and bent people into an arc, there was tuberculosis of the joints. It destroyed cartilage and bone, turning movement into torture. Knees and hips would swell, covered in fistulas from which pus mixed with small bone fragments would ooze. Tuberculous meningitis, which affected the membranes of the brain, led to excruciating headaches, convulsions, paralysis, and inevitable death in delirium and agony. This enemy was everywhere. It could strike at any point. The story of the New England vampire panic is not just folklore. It is a documented hysteria born of desperation and ignorance. The Brown family of Exeter, Rhode Island, lost the mother and eldest daughter to consumption. Then the son, Edwin, fell ill. When the second daughter, 19-year-old Mercy, also died, her desperate father, George Brown, gave in to the persuasion of his neighbors. They were convinced that one of the deceased family members was a vampire who came at night and sucked the life out of Edwin.